This is IAQ Radio, Indoor Air Quality Radio, the voice of the indoor air quality industry, with your host, Radio Joe Hughes, and the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. And now, Radio Joe Hughes.
Good day, wherever you're listening from. This should be an interesting one today. We've got a great show. Live with us today are Ed Light and Paul Haas. I'm calling them the Building Dynamics Duo. They're with Building Dynamics LLC outside of D.C. in the Maryland area, and looking forward to a great show talking about moisture, mold, and practical answers to complex questions. Before we get started, let's thank our marquee sponsor. Wait, I got a new sponsor I have to announce also, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute. See more deeply through science and research. Learn more at CIRI-science.org. That's C-I-R-I science.org.
IAQ Radio Platinum sponsor is John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com.
I also want to thank our gold sponsors, Particles Plus, Healthy Indoors Magazine, Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, and AEML Inc. Laboratory. And of course, our association sponsors, the Indoor Air Quality Association and the Restoration Industry Association.
And now you can win a cool prize. It's time for the IAQ Radio Trivia question. Be the first to correctly answer. Simply email your answer to czlotnick@cs.com. Or if listening live, just text your answer from your computer. And now, here's the Z-Man with this week's IAQ Radio Trivia question.
Hello, everyone. Congratulations go out to John Lepoter, Indoor Air Quality Solutions, Orlando, Florida, for being first to identify actinomycetes as the heterogeneous group of gram-positive, generally anaerobic bacteria noted for a filamentous and branching growth pattern that results in most forms in an extensive colony or mycelium. The IQ Radio Trivia question for today, Friday, April 26, 2019, has been sponsored by Ideas, a solution chemistry company providing unique solutions to odor removal, surface cleaning, and decontamination problems. Here is today's trivia question. Identify the term that is used to describe a property of a thermodynamic system that is equal to the system's internal energy plus the product of its pressure and volume. Back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Cliff. We've got the Building Dynamics Duo today. Paul Haas has an MS in Industrial Hygiene from the University of Southern Cal, and a BA in Environmental Science, also from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's authored many peer-reviewed scientific publications and is member of an elite group of surfers who enjoy bluegrass music. You'll understand that better in a moment. He's also working now with Ed Light at Building Dynamics LLC. Ed is the president of Building Dynamics. He's an AIHA fellow and the author of the hit song, There's a Fungus Among Us. Ed has investigated the entire spectrum of IAQ problems, ranging from buildings in the coldest climates on Earth, the South Pole Station, to the ultimate hot air building, the White House. Ed, I think you've got your own intro music. Let's hear it.
When it gets too hot for comfort and you can't eat ice cream cold, ain't no sin. Take off your skin and dance around in your bones. Wear your bathing suit to the office. Soak your feet while on the phone. It ain't no sin. Take off your skin and dance around in your bones. The polar bears are mad up in Greenland. They got no room to dance. Their homes are shrinking, and it's got me thinking that they might as well live in France. Like those bamboo babies on the tropic island zone. Ain't no sin to take off your skin and dance around in your bones.
Thank you, Ed. You're the only one we've ever had play their own intro music. I love it. And by the way, Ed, you have to look at today's show announcement. Make sure you look at the quote of the week. It's especially for you. All right, let's get Paul Haas on here. Paul, I know you've got to run, so I want to start with you today and get a little bit. I know you've been a long time listener to the show. It's great to finally have you on the show.
Thanks, Joe.
We're talking about moisture conditions and what threshold moisture condition is necessary to initiate humidity-related mold growth. So I think we're going to start with humidity-related mold growth because I know you guys have been looking at that in particular in some school buildings.
That's right, Joe. You know, the real question often is asked is, are sustained temperatures and relative humidity, I live in the hot South, are they the responsibility for mold growth? And you'll hear a lot of good scientific literature, which you have to wade through, to state that, especially in the restoration industry, that relative humidity in excess of, let's say, 65% must be controlled so as to avoid humidity-related mold growth. That might be a good baseline. However, typically, and the scientific and the engineering bodies that have researched this and we get our guidance from often say that sustained relative humidity in excess of 80% relative humidity over a prolonged period would be that such that it would be capable of sustaining mold growth. The problem is it is site dependent. And we've dealt with a few studies, and we'll talk a little bit, Ed will cover more than myself, but we'll talk about it. But the fact is molds can grow at all humidities and do, from the Antarctic all the way to the White House. And those need to be considered, particularly in the light when people are alleging or calling you out, us out, we CIHs. And I just want to say one thing about CIHs quickly. We do not clean teeth in the workplace. but the point I want to nail down is, because Ed's going to take you on a journey. Ed, hold on. You get your turn for 45 minutes. I've got to go to an airport.
Okay.
When Ed talks, he's going to talk about thresholds that we've seen. So empirical data is always better than theoretical data. Thanks, Joe. Back to you.
Paul, thank you. And Ed, let me have you jump in here.
Oh, I was just going to say that CIHs don't do teeth, and most of them don't know much about buildings, and I'll shut up.
I think that's a good point. Now, you mentioned relative humidity several times there, Paul, and I want to know, and this kind of I didn't prepare you for this, but I just your thoughts on, rather than using relative humidity, what about using dew point like they recommend in the EPA Moisture Control Guide? Have you found that to be helpful when you're dealing with facilities people, or are you better off just sticking with talking about relative humidity?
Well, you've said a mouthful there, and I would put it this way. However you communicate to your client, make sure they understand that the amount of available moisture in the air is not the same as the moisture that's on the surface. So dew point plays into that. And I like to say, I used to teach a class in Georgia, and they love to talk about, how hot it is in Georgia. And I tell people that when you use the term psychometrics, it is not to cause people to go to a psychiatrist. It's actually to understand the relationships between temperature, moisture, and then things like relative humidity. So it's critical that dew point is an excellent parlay, particularly when you're talking about and I know we're going to ask me quickly about mechanically conditioned spaces, either cooled, dehumidified, or heated. That, in fact, is the term that should be discussed.
Is the dew point.
Is the dew point.
Okay, so the way I've kind of described it in the past, and I wonder if you agree, you have moisture content in building materials, oftentimes expressed as a percent moisture content. That would be accurate with wood, not so much with other things. But then you've also got the humidity conditions, the dew point conditions, the relative humidity conditions in the building. And it seems to me like you sometimes reach a tipping point where a combination of these issues leads to the mold growth. Has that been your experience?
It has. In the building sciences, and we're really lucky to have someone who's allowed us to use that term. I don't think that most people understand that the complications that rest in buildings, particularly, again, when you talk about available moisture, it's okay to talk about drying after a flood, but to maintain a building in such a condition that it is dry and it will not support mold growth is far different. And it is so important to get the nature of the problem, especially when it gets to, to conditions. And I gotta tell you, you hit the nail on the head. Too many people walk out with an infrared camera or a moisture meter and say, this area is wet, without a lot of basis for that discussion.
So I wanted to go to the mechanical system, but you just led me to another quick question then. What would be the better way to, or what else should they be doing to present that information that the building is wet, rather than just doing a thermal image or just a moisture meter? What other things should we be doing?
A combination of things come into play. One is the area in question or the location in question typical or normal? Is it, what are the operating conditions? If, for example, in a residence or commercial building, what is the thermostat in the area set to? What is, in fact, a couple of days of data logging, a good, inexpensive data logger will give you just a tremendous amount of data, more data for most people. But then you can begin to show, periods where the temperature and relative humidity change by daytime, nighttime cycles. You can also show how long the unit runs by showing, say, a plateau in the dry bulb temperature. So it gets a little bit thick when it comes down to the building science part, but for the layperson part, get them to understand there's a relationship. Temperature goes up, relative humidity goes down. However, the amount of available moisture that's in the air could, in fact, remain relatively constant, or it might change depending on the conditions that rest there. So I hope I answered that question. That's a very complicated question.
I think we'll be continuing to talk about that as the day goes on here, but let's go to the, I think, tough question for building owners, and that is, how does the operation of the HVAC system contribute to humidity-related moisture and mold growth?
Well, that one's simple. You made my life very comfortable there. I hate asking questions after questions. That's another trait of CIHs. The point is, the air conditioning system, if properly designed, was to design optimal comfort and a range of temperature and relative humidity, which describe comfort. And those conditions are generally also followed by, unless there are other prevailing factors, followed by a typical range of your relative humidity or your dew points that are ascribed for that climate. So if a properly designed system is operating, then we typically will say those conditions are within, I'm going to put a term out, they got to be careful, but they're within that ASHRAE winter summer zone. And just to clarify that tends to be an area of temperature and relative humidity rather than just a single point. And
that's more based on comfort, isn't it? And how does that
absolutely.
So what do we need to do to change that, or to change thinking so that people are thinking more about moisture as opposed to just comfort? I don't know if that was a good question or not, but what do you?
Ed, you can jump in on this one, but I would say that I learned this from a senior mechanical engineer when I was trying to describe excess ventilation in schools. And he said to me right straight up in a series of voices, he could say, air don't care.
Interesting. Ed?
So we've done some interesting scientific experiments. We don't get research grants. We just work on our building. But we had an opportunity to compare conditions in 2 summers. One when with the schools vacant and humidity mold grew all over the place in one summer and not in another summer. And what we found was that you can be real uncomfortable, but it takes an awful lot of high humidity for several days to actually start that mold growing. So actually controlling to comfort should not get enough humidity to grow mold. However, a lot of HVAC systems and air conditioning is just pretty much for controlling the temperature. And in those, with that system, if you get really sustained humid weather outside, and that might not even be so hot, it's just a bunch of rainy days, then that humidity, even though the temperature is controlled inside, the humidity can jump way up in the building. You can even get humidity mold in an occupied building if that humidity has been way up there. And you better stop me because I'll keep going.
Well, and I know Paul's got to run here, so I want to get back in. I'd like to get back to that topic, Ed, when we have just you here. But Paul, before you got to run, so we're talking about relative humidity and equipment and HVAC systems. So what level of humidity control is really needed? I mean, based on your experience, do we have to keep below 70% all the time? Can it go above 70%? A couple hours here and there? Where do you stand on that?
Well, here's where the state of the practitioner is right now, Joe. In this case, one must understand that surface moisture is different than air temperature and air moisture. So if you can assist us by stating that we're not trying to make this complicated, but the amount of equilibrium relative humidity at the surface, depending on the materials in the space, and I hate to say it depends, but that's an empirical measurement. That's a measurement we can make that's actually made with a moisture meter. Now, you mentioned wood. Southern softwood has a moisture content, if it's kiln dried, of about 17 to 19%. That's the amount of water that's in the wood. That could be repeated many times in many locations, depending on the status. That is also equivalent, if you could, that wood moisture equivalent to the amount of moisture that's leaving. And again, this is not, it's not meant for graduate study, but that's the amount of moisture that you're trying to either add to or dry to, or that will accept the amount of moisture. That's known as the reciprocal, or if you divide equilibrium relative humidity by 1, you're going to get active water. That number in percentage is how wet that material is. No doubt about it. And that's what we should be looking for. Now, you want to control, you're all the pros in the drying business, right?
Many are.
Yeah, and in the drying business, we want to try to remove as many grains of moisture so as to get the whole system to dry to achieve a wood moisture equivalency, let's say, of between, a little bit more than 17 to 19, because you don't want to over dry, but you want to get that by removing the moisture in the air and try to drive that moisture out and get it to equilibrium with the environment that's in. Let's say 20%, 22. So we can actually watch that occur over time. That's an example that I was hoping I could convey.
Well, I'm just wondering, I would imagine a lot of restoration people, drying people, even the IEQ consultants out there, they're probably thinking to themselves right now, geez, 17 to 20%. I'm not comfortable leaving building materials at 17% moisture content. Can you comment on that?
Well, that's not related to every bit of material that's in a building. So that's episode 2, because that is a particular material. Southern yellow pine, for example.
Gotcha. Okay.
So when we say that, it's important not to over dry, but it's also important to get rid of the source of water that caused the excess moisture to occur, and then attack it systematically. Things may have to dry over time. They may not dry. And remember, a lot of our material now is sustainable. And if it's sustainable, anyone that's seen oriented strand board or other materials, even plywood, if looked at under a scanning electron microscope, it's going to look like a bunch of straws all stacked together that actually have pathways for water to be retained very aggressively for a long time. Drywall is another thing. And I'd love to come back or have some pros from the U.S. Gypsum Association, without using that trademark, or someone from the drywall industry come back and talk about how dry they want drywall to be. That's beyond this show, but that is a really important discussion to have, along with all the newer stuff.
Well, I agree, and I think it's something to take you up on and do down the road. But before you go, there was an important question I thought here. How can
I got to put in my plugs?
All right,
go ahead, shoot.
How can unoccupied schools be air conditioned to prevent humidity-related mold growth, but yet be consistent with energy conservation? We don't want to run a mechanical system all summer if there's nobody in the building. So how do you guys at Building Dynamics, what do you recommend to building owners? In this case, we'll talk about school districts because they have an unusual situation. Do you tell them they've got to run their mechanical system all summer, or is there some other way they can prevent this humidity-related mold growth?
Let me put it this way. Across this nation, if we could put together just a very simple description. We put together some papers, but they need to be distilled down to, let's say, an 8th grade education. But we're on a journey here, and the journey says, from an energy standpoint, not necessarily from a mold standpoint, that we can clearly construct a plan where we run systems, depending on it's very complex what you're asking, but that will have either a chilled water system or a DX system, a Freon system that will run at the appropriate times after the appropriate people, flood mop floors, for example, wax floors, so that we can put together a system that, again, we've come up with a term, we haven't coined it, we haven't trademarked it yet, called time of wetness, but that gives a person a simple rubric that they can follow, a scheme of devices, if it would be. And can I put in my plugs real quick?
Sure. Let me just...
All right. Go ahead.
Well, you mentioned this time of wetness. I think that's a good concept. And you mentioned different buildings may have different, needs with respect to moisture control and humidity. So it sounds to me like it kind of depends. And it's a site-by-site, building-by-building call. Is that accurate to say?
That is accurate, but there is a sweet spot there.
Okay, and I think we'll have Ed talk about the sweet spot when he gets when we get him on here, and after you've got to go. Paul, before you go, I know you wanted to say a few things.
I just want to give a shout out to my lovely family, Peggy, and my 4 children, Kenny, Joanne, PJ, and Hannah. Also want to thank the good Lord for my grandchildren, who I will see tomorrow morning. I'm actually kind of poised to push the ball down the road a little bit on building science, and I want to, if you would, I'm putting out a shameless plug for both BDL and a company called Sill Dry. I threw Cliff at that this week. I think they'll be a lot of fun. Joel Glickman and Michael Aratan are the principals of that firm. They will be fascinating to talk to. In building construction, Sildry, sildry.com.
I ordered one of their products. They'll give you a free example. They have it looks like it's plastic essentially, and it's a window pin flashing. The whole thing is all kind of put together. It looks very interesting.
Yep, and they're a Pennsylvania company, so they're American made, and you'll find them to be quite a lot of fun. You take a field trip and invite me with you. And then last but not least, I think Cliff and my erstwhile colleague, Dr. C, Felicia C. and Ciarulo, I think they should get together and explain what kind of nefarious plans they have in place for this experiment they're doing on cleaning effectiveness. I'm holding them out as possible co-conspirators.
There you go. I'd love it. Cliff, will you be talking about that at the Healthy Building Summit this year?
Maybe we could.
October 16th to 18th. We hope to have Paul and Ed join us up there this year. It should be a lot of fun. Well, Paul, thanks again.
Gentlemen, thank you.
Really appreciate it. I know you've got to run, and I look forward to talking again in the future.
See you again soon, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, Paul. Ed, let's take it over to you, Ed. First, anything you'd like to add to what we just talked about with Paul? I'm still feeling a little like I need a little more concrete steps to take and something for Cliff to put in the blog. Like, what are the Cliff notes from what we just talked about?
Okay, so you asked two important practical questions. How can HVAC systems be run in occupied schools over the summer so you don't get mold? And we have worked with schools in a number of situations. Usually we start out, got to remediate the mold, and typically the engineering isn't thought out as far as prevention, which is the most important thing. So what we have recommended is where there is sufficient humidity to potentially grow mold in the building over the summer is to try out a couple hours of system operation to pull humidity out and do that the peak of the day, which in the building is a little bit behind the outside, so say late afternoon. And those buildings will not be comfortable on hot days, but we predict that there will not be enough moisture in the air to grow humidity. And I'm very excited because I think this summer we finally have one of our school systems is going to try this out. I guess they're about to decide. And huge amounts of utility money and wasted energy go into running HVAC air conditioning continuously or half days over the summer. And the problem with vacant schools is usually way overreaction or way underreaction, which is kind of the case with most of your IAQ problems. When it's not science-based, you way overreact or you way underreact. So a lot of schools have no air conditioning in the summer, or a lot that have had mold problems just go crazy with the air conditioning, have huge bills. And being good ASHRAE members, we try to strike a balance here. And in fact, our presentation in our papers through ASHRAE Journal have found that this is an IAQ problem that doesn't cost you more money to deal with, but actually you can save a lot of money by not over air conditioning. And in fact, over air conditioning cools the air so much and increases the relative humidity that you're growing more mold and you're actually uncomfortable even in occupied buildings when you overcool. Overcooling is one of the big factors in growing humidity mold.
Ed, let me ask you this. So I want to get some concrete recommendations now for, let's say I've got a school. In fact, I'll be talking to some school people in a couple of weeks down in Greenville, South Carolina. So you're feeling like if we looked at their dew point, their relative humidity over a period of time and got to understand when it gets highest during the summer, and like you say, it's going to lag a little behind the outdoors, so maybe late afternoon. Your thought is that we may be able to just run that mechanical system for a couple of hours a day to help lower it enough to kind of break that cycle. I think I could sum that up correctly. If not, let me know. The second part of it is, would we not be just as well off to use maybe some dehumidifiers in that situation as opposed to using the air conditioning, and bring the humidity levels or the dew point temperature down enough in the building, kind of instead of the whole mechanical system being on, maybe just use some dehumidifiers? Have you done that as well?
Oh, absolutely. Seen many cases, again, verging on overkill, overreaction, where because they've got the humidity mold, they'll bring in dozens, even you've seen hundreds of dehumidifiers. And so you have optional ways of controlling the humidity. And it's best to use your HVAC. And one of the factors we usually see when the humidity has gotten bad enough to grow mold is there's all kinds of stuff in disrepair and out of whack on the systems. So, so one of the first steps we would do is get maintenance troubleshoot and fix their system. And then we have our controls guy in and see if the controls are working right. And then sometimes we change the sequences because those are going against your moisture control. And to make things a lot simpler for schools, what we have suggested is try a few hours of air conditioning in late afternoon, and monitor from there. And you have plenty of warning in advance before mold will actually start growing. I mean, the rooms will feel damp, and then you'll start getting a slight musty smell. And the simplest thing I've been advocating is just you got an unoccupied school, make the custodians check every room every day. And it's amazing how many schools, the doors are shut all summer, and then August, the day before teachers are coming, oh my God, our clean room is tropical rainforest. So, and it's even better, and it's like Paul says, real cheap. Stick a temperature humidity data logger in some representative rooms, or even a critical worst case room, and download it once in a while, and just track your humidity and your dew point, and it will tell you if you're at risk. If humidity is going for more than a day or so up over 80%, that's a key warning indicator. And actually, with all the research and publication on these subjects, there's very little practical applied research on this, and no practical guidance for our school systems or other buildings that deal with humidity, mold, and how to run vacant or unoccupied periods in the building. And I'm on the ASHRAE Moisture Committee with Lou Harriman, and those are real important topics to us. And we have a lot of frustration that mechanical engineers really aren't tuned in to controlling moisture. And when it gets over to the AIHA that I'm active in, it's even worse as far as industrial hygienists truly understanding and appreciating moisture and humidity control in a building. You see mold, you clean it up, and very often wait till it grows back, and the consultants and labs get plenty of business because they're not controlling the source. And if you understand the engineering and work with the facilities people, there are very practical, simple answers. And now we're talking about the humidity mold question, which actually will save a lot of buildings and owners money to prevent the mold.
Ed, we've got to stop and thank our sponsors. When we get back, I want to go back to some of the other questions that we missed here. We had to change the order a little bit since Paul had to leave. And I want to talk a little bit more about water activity and moisture content and drying of buildings as well, because we've got a large group of listeners that are restoration contractors, and they're getting some mixed signals. So we'll be back in 90 seconds with the second half of our show. We've got Ed Light of Building Dynamics.
IAQ Radio Platinum sponsor is John Donne Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at jondon.com. That's JONDON.com. Gold sponsors are Particles Plus Engineers and Manufacturers of feature-rich particle counters and air quality monitoring instrumentation. Learn more at particlesplus.com. Count on us. Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions available at healthyindoors.com. And AEML Laboratories, free FedEx shipping, great pricing, same-day results, and never a rush fee. Learn more at AEMLinc.com. Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, who use advanced sensor software technology and embedded computers to provide superior environmental test instrumentation. Visit them at wolfsense.com. Association sponsors are the Indoor Air Quality Association, a multi-disciplinary organization dedicated to promoting the exchange of indoor environmental information through education and research. Learn more at IAQA.org. And RIA, the Restoration Industry Association, the granddaddy of the restoration industry, networks with leaders. Learn more at restorationindustry.org.
I also want to thank our newest sponsor, CIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute. See more deeply through science and research. Learn more at ciriscience.org. Hey, before I go over to Cliff, I want you to get a question in here. But before I do, Ed, I got a text that I think is really important, and I think it adds to the conversation that we had just a moment ago. Good guidance in the in the ASHRAE document, but in schools he's saying you need to shut off the outdoor air vents and turn off all the exhaust in the summer. That way you're not sucking in humid outdoor air and have less grains of moisture to remove. What do you think of that?
Oh, that's absolutely in our recommendations and guidance, and I'm giving you the comic book version here. So negative air in buildings, and I've seen very rarely schools that are positively pressurized. Negative air sucking in humidity in the middle of the summer is a huge factor. And so in buildings we're troubleshooting or advising on, we shut off all the exhaust we can, except maybe a few toilets. And then as far as outside air, we don't need ventilation when there's no occupants, and it depends on the system whether that's practical. And in some cases, even with the unit ventilators, we've just closed off the outside air for the summer. And of course, that stops your huge source of moisture, which is the humidity from outside. So you got to look at each system, and it's exact things you do are going to differ by climate zone. And the bottom line for this and the drying restoration questions is you don't want to get mold. And practical answers to that are out there. The research is confusing and inconclusive on these questions. And again, without research grants and just going out and looking at tons of buildings, we've come up with some ideas, and non-statistically non-statistical data showing that there are solutions to these. And I might mention here that in regards to preventing mold, the restoration industry and the good practitioners, for example, we got Pete and Cliff here, they understand drying and moisture and the tools to do it. And the bottom line is they'll get a building dry and the mold's gone and you're not getting it back. That's the bottom line. Scientifically and standards-wise, this stuff is all gray area and inconclusive. But bottom line is don't grow mold. And Cliff and Pete know how to do that.
Bad, clean, good. Cliff, go for it.
Yeah, Ed, my question is, I don't remember where I saw this. Pete has a better memory than I, but I was taught at a class that you can measure the water activity of a surface by taking a hygrometer, temperature hygrometer, placing it on the surface, covering it with plastic and duct tape, allowing it to equalize. And it typically does this in, like a minute or two. And then what you would do is you would take this reading and move the decimal point over 2 places to the left, and that would give you the water activity of this headspace. And if that's true, I don't understand why all these people are trying to determine the same thing in very difficult and expensive and impractical ways.
My understanding is, well, first of all, I believe that would give you a good quantitative estimate of water activity and what you do with that water activity measurement and how much you really need that to assess a building and to dry a building is debatable. But as far as that measurement, I haven't played with that so much. What I did play with is the prototype meter by I guess it was the
Delmhorst
company, and that was a more sophisticated, a little more quantitative, and we had recommendations to them to improve it, and now it's no longer never got to production.
Right.
And so instrumentation could be developed. I'm not sure one's out there to measure water activity quantitatively. And that seat of the pants method you're talking about, and Paul has fooled with this stuff more than me, but I believe that would give you a real good estimate for understanding water activity. And
thanks. I think, again, I think it's practical. I think it also helps in training people to get them to understand it. And, with your consulting, it might not be a bad thing to take a piece of drywall and wet it and put it in a plastic bag. And that way you can explain to, people in schools what you're trying to prevent and trying to control and so on and so forth. Then they can visibly see the difference between what the humidity is in the room and what it is on a surface, because, I've never seen a perfect building. They all tend to leak. And, if we look hard enough, we're going to find some sort of wet area in that building. If we look even harder, we're going to find mold. So I thank you for your answer.
And there's 2 experiments we did, which were, just practical ones that were interesting. I can give them to you real quick. So one was just comparing moisture meter readings in drying framing wood to the prototype water activity meter. And it did show great differences, but for the specific wood type and condition, you could get a pretty good graph showing the relationship. What was interesting is we were getting water activities in the growth range when the moisture meter was saying you pass as far as a typical drying situation. And there's a big question in my mind about water activity. You got all this theoretical biological research and wood science research, but when does mold actually grow? So we had another great opportunity. So we worked for builders that build apartment buildings, wood framed apartment buildings. They just got so soaked last summer with the changing weather, which is actually why I did my climate change song to introduce the show. And so we just did work in dozens of large apartment buildings. Framing was full of mold, the framing was soaked, and we found an interesting place to define the action level for this type of framing wood in this situation where mold was regrowing, because we had these big crews bleaching mold and then also trying to dry out the wood. And so the treating bleaching guys would get way ahead of the drying guys. And so by getting lots of measurements, we found that with the moisture meter, over 20% moisture, that mold would grow back quickly after they remediated it off. And under 20%, it was not regrowing at all. So that was kind of interesting. And I'm sure the water activities would have theoretically predicted mold. So we really have to research and understand this better. But like I said, meanwhile, the industry's out there drying stuff, and you got restorers who actually know what they're doing and do their jobs right. You get it down dry and it won't grow back.
Well, let me ask you a question now. Based on seeing what you said, dozens of apartment buildings under construction with fungal growth on the wood, would you be, after seeing this and seeing what was involved in the cost of the remediation and so on and so forth, would you be in favor or against a treatment, a treatment of the wood in situ that would prevent that? Not only for the construction time, but for many, many years. I mean, there are products that are out there that are not costly. It would be a lot less expensive than the labor of the cleanup and the embarrassment of disclosure, to buyers and so on and so forth.
Well, that's a very timely question, because in a lot of these sites we were working, the salesmen for the hocus pocus treatments had been out there and made proposals to treat everything, to treat the mold and to prevent mold.
Right.
And our client, the general contractor, favored the approach both economically and because we gave him the science. These treatments, first of all, for the active mold, you're just going to seal over moisture. That's completely stupid. And then for the prevention, you don't need to make everything antimicrobial as far as wood framing. You got to maintain and operate your building well. And really for these antimicrobial, they are preventing growth to some extent, but if things get wet long enough, it grows anyway. And so our opinion is don't encapsulate, don't seal, don't treat wood. You remediate the surface, make sure it's dry, and we don't advocate encapsulating or treating wood. And boy, there's a lot of hard sells going on for those products. There's just a lot of money to be made in this industry.
Well, Ed,
Ed, is your issue is your issue not allowing water vapor to pass through? I mean, because that shouldn't be an issue with a lot of the products. There are many products, borates, et cetera, that would even provide termite prevention. There are salts. There are a lot of things that wouldn't seal the wood. They're just on the wood, and they don't necessarily have a color. You can't tell that they're there. They don't have a smell. They don't have a high toxicity addition, to the materials. But, there are some products out there. I just wondered, what your issues were.
Okay, well, I have issues. First of all, with the when you have mold growing, and these products are advocated for remediation. They're not disinfectants. They don't kill the mold. And even if they would allow the wood to dry, you still got your mold there. And for the prevention, like something like borates, you get it wet long enough, the mold will still grow. And our approach is maintain your building, keep it as dry as you can, and you get a local problem, you bring in your good water restoration and take care of it.
I think one difference, the difference is it's prevention, not remediation. So the surfaces are treated before you have an issue, rather than waiting for the issue to occur. And they could be treated with disinfectants. I mean, there are products, that are out there that have been proven, in construction in Florida and so on and so forth. It's just, I was just trying to find out what your issues were, but
right.
We've got other stuff to talk about.
Yeah. And so just real quick, the treatment for prevention isn't needed if the building's maintained. And our experience, most of the wood, most of the surfaces do stay dry for the life of the building. And when stuff happens, you take care of it. One thing we have found is that, of course, any area that is likely to get wet or be subject to moisture, use resistant materials. The resistant drywall works great in particularly when we just finished the Super Bowl stadium, Mercedes-Benz, and our client, general contractor, had all that drywall changed to resistant. There's so much to talk about. I'll shut up.
Okay.
And real quick, I want to go to the roundup and bring in the Restoration Industries Global Watchdog to say hello, Pete Consigli. But before we do, when you remove drywall because it's water damaged and moldy, what moisture content do you recommend the wood be back to, the framing be back to, prior to putting new drywall up?
So we've seen standard rules of thumb, 19%, 15%, and our experience is below 19% seems to be okay. So 15% is better as far as being conservative. And this is an area where more research could really benefit to be sure what we're doing and be cost effective. Again, the bottom line is we want to prevent mold from growing back. And I always, when we're doing response to wet buildings, I always say getting rid of the mold is the easy part. The most important thing that people miss is we don't want to leave trapped moisture that's not going to dry out anywhere. So even if we get most of the wood dry, if something's going to get sealed or covered over in the construction that stays wet, and that's where you got your failures and your stink in a few years.
Okay, John, let's go to the roundup. Oh. All right, let's bring in the watchdog, the Restoration Industries Global Watchdog, Pete Consigli. Pete, I know you've got to have a couple comments or questions for both.
Yeah, it's been an interesting show. It's funny listen, Ed and Paul, these guys talk about the problems with the schools in the summer. It reminds me of McGinnis. For years I've been listening to McGinnis talk about, in Jersey, all the schools, they do all the carpet cleaning in the summer months, and they always forget to reset to override the HVAC systems, which they have on energy saving mode. And so there winds up being so much moisture in their buildings, and the carpet doesn't dry, they all turn to mold. And it's unbelievable. I think it's like a lifetime opportunity for McGinnis, because I don't know how many times in some of these schools he goes in there and they have to use like asbestos protocols to pull this moldy carpet out without contaminating the entire building. And I don't know, I would suspect that that's probably a bigger problem with the schools and doing stuff in the summertime and cleaning processes like that, where they're just not removing any of the excess humidity and the moisture that they're putting into these buildings. What are your thoughts on that, Ed?
So we work with schools on that, and that is an instance where, as Joe brought up, could you use dehumidifiers? And so there's no need to have mold after carpet cleaning. And it's good to clean the carpets, because that's where most of your symptoms from allergic people come. It's not from mold spores, it's from the stuff in carpets.
Yeah, right.
You just have, we got where we're actually involved and somebody listens to us, we have floor fans or dehumidifiers or temporary operation of that zone of the HVAC when they're doing the carpet extraction, and you don't get mold at all. And running a whole HVAC or a whole zone for a few days will dry it out, but that's a huge waste of energy. Just take care of those individual spaces, and oftentimes just your floor fans or some kind of
Well, I think that
the big thing is keep those doors open, man. They do a carpet and the air's off and the door's closed, and you don't need to. I mean, you just predict molds there after about 3 or 4 days, and sure.
Yeah. Well, I think what the issue is that a lot of times in these schools, it just falls through the cracks. They don't think about it. They could bring supplemental equipment in, but I mean, the thing is, if they, depending on how big of an area they were doing, if they actually were able to control just the zone, the normal air conditioning probably could dry it. Maybe it'd be energy efficient, maybe it wouldn't. But the thing is, it just seems that these are problems which they should be able to avoid, at least in New Jersey. But like I say, some of these guys, it's kind of like it's like their summer income. It's like a separate job for them from normal work. Hey, listen, talking about the water activity, and Cliff brought that up, and I remember, Ed, were doing some work with one of the home builders in D.C., playing around with those sensors that Decagon made and trying to test for the water activity. And I had been involved with some industry groups too, who actually didn't want to release the information, unfortunately, and I tried for a long time, and I don't think they have. But I don't know if it's a secret. I mean, Lou Herman was involved in trying to, guide that company to make a sensor that could, in some cost-effective way, and not take too long to determine water activity, because it'd be a more accurate way to determine whether these surfaces are dried versus, the different meters that are used. I think it'd be a supplement to. I remember the young salesman. He doesn't work with Decagon anymore, but he kind of thought if they came out with this was going to supplant and like put Delmhorst and Tremex out of business. And we said, no, hold on there. It's just another tool, and it could be an interesting and a useful tool, but then nothing ever came of it, which is unfortunate. I know that they were at one of the IAQA shows, and Ian Cull got onto that thing there, Misty Hughes, and he was trying to do some stuff with it, but I don't think anything kind of came of it. And I'm kind of sad to hear that, because the argument that happened when they were working with those sensors was to try to figure out who's going to control the platform where the information got uploaded to, and how they utilize the information and what the protocols would be. In my mind, I still think there's an opportunity for something like that could be useful in the industry. Particularly when there's litigation, or if somebody, there's some special circumstances where they want that level of, certainty, if you would, that these building materials are dry. I don't think that it's going to be, become mainstream. I don't know. Maybe I could be wrong. If Brother Phil Morey had his way, he would definitely love to see something like that. you know, and that would be a very quotable item in an expert witness report or something. But what are your thoughts, Ed? Anything you can share in the work that you did? What happened? Where it might go? What you think?
I had thought that out several years ago when I was playing with that meter, and my idea was that moisture meter and infrared are the working tools for identifying and tracking and clearing, and your water activity measurements would be a supplement to that. And one of the great limitations is that you do a spot, and the spot moisture meters, you can zip along and do millions of spots like I was doing just before I got here in a project. Infrared, if you use it intelligently and know the limitations, will tell you a whole lot. And what I've learned from the water activity measurements is there can be a relationship between moisture meter readings and that, but it's very specific for the material and actually for that building environment you're working in. And then the other question I've raised from this other work we did on trying to dry out moldy apartment buildings where the mold keeps growing back is so what does water activity numbers mean? Theoretically, when you get these numbers of water activity, the mold could grow down to 5, and a lot of mold will grow at above 8. And I believe and nobody's studied that in a controlled proper experiment, a simple experiment. And I believe that mold doesn't grow. Oh, I need to cut my answer short. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the point is that there was a lot of messing around with it. I think there were good intentions, and then it stopped and it never was brought to market. And I'm not so sure that I think there could be a use for it in the market. I guess that was the main point. During that time, a few years back when that was happening, I was pretty regularly, at least a couple times a year, going out to Purdue to do some guest lectures, with their students in the disaster reconstruction and the demo programs. And what I found out there by accident is that they're actually in the agricultural department of Purdue. Decagon actually has been working with them for years and utilizes that technology in that industry where they want to, check the water activity in grain silos and all those kind of things, which is where I think they originated from, to make sure that they don't have mold growth in there, because that can have big health implications in the farming industry. And but there, the time isn't an issue like restoration. I mean, it could take an hour to take a reading in a specific area, and that's fine. What we told them, they said, we can't wait that long. They said, what's the most you can wait? They said, well, after 5 minutes, you'll lose us. I mean, we get instant readings, and most of the stuff, a minute or two is about all we could do. But they were trying to narrow it down in minutes. And I don't know, maybe one day it'll happen. But anyway, I thought it was interesting, and I was happy to see you really trying to play around with it in the new construction market, because I think a lot of these companies do construction drying and things of that nature. I think it would have really good value there, and could protect against some potential litigation and all that. So anyway, for whatever it's worth, interesting. We'll see whatever comes of it. So
all right, hey Cliff, I know you got a quick comment, but I know Ed also has to run. So if you could get your 2 comments in, then we'll let Ed go.
Yeah, no, I do. Pete, first of all, I think some technologies are fundamentally flawed. They're unaffordable. They're not practical. And I think sometimes people just need to let it go and move on. Ed, my only comment for you, thanks for joining us, but if you'd be kind enough to send me the lyrics from the song, I'd like to put it into the blog, and because it's kind of hard to hear everything and so on and so forth. The kazoo was a little overwhelming.
Usually the sound man complains about my whistle. It blows it up.
Okay.
And, by the way, I just finished writing that on the way here and had never practiced it, but
it was good. But if you can send me the lyrics,
absolutely amazing. Ed, before we go, anything you'd like to add? I know you've got to run.
No, this was a great show, and my day has gone real well. We're in the process of doing working with a builder on low-income apartment building renovations, and we're going building by building to find and take care of the water damage and sources of moisture. And I got my building done this morning. We've got this down to a great system with the contractors. And what's really interesting in this is that the architects, when they design renovations of these really poorly maintained, wet, damaged, low-income and public housing buildings, don't think about the water damage and the moisture sources. And our client, the GC, gets to the job and they run into mold. They're not sure what to do. I come in there and I said, look, let's sell the owner on the idea of adding this to the work, so when they reoccupy a renovated building, they'll actually be free of mold and water. And so we've gotten huge change orders and owners' decisions favorable to go ahead with mold, water damage, moisture project out of these. So I got my vest on. We're in there. We got a whole apartment building done this morning. And now they're putting it back together in a nice renovation.
Ed, my guess would be you didn't take one sample.
Okay, my mold sampling stuff is rusting in my basement, and I haven't taken a mold sample in 20 years.
You know, Ed, I think it's an important point. I also think that I'm going to continue to encourage those out there in this industry, especially doing IAQ consulting, to learn more about building science, because I think you're a perfect example of someone that could do a lot of sampling if you wanted to. You're a certified industrial hygienist, but I think you show us, and I continue to promote to listeners and those that are attending classes, that really it's learning the building science is more important than learning how to take samples. And you're going to be able to have a longer career helping people like you are now, Ed. You go through a building, you figure out what are the building science issues, where are the moisture issues, let's fix that. If you want some documentation, we can provide it. But I just think you're a great example of what we've been trying to promote here for years.
Thank you. Oh, he mentioned the late Phil Morey. He was my mentor. He was 40 years ago. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And he took me out in the field and really got me started. And then we totally parted ways over the idea of mold sampling versus really understanding the problem. Mm-hmm. And may he rest in peace. He's a great guy.
Yeah. Well,
I remember the meeting that we had in Charlotte in 1998 with you and Ronald Gotts and Phil Morey, and Ecker Johanning was supposed to be there, but he had to go to Germany for his annual summer visit. So it was like a cage match. Phil had to take both of you guys on at one time, but of course he couldn't challenge Gotts because he wasn't an MD. But I remember that was an interesting discussion in the late 90s, because that was right on the cusp before the mold is gold days, and there was a big split within the industrial hygiene community, and you were right in there with both of your rubber boots on. And I remember our friend David, he was the guy, I think, Cliff, that actually introduced Ed kind of to the restoration guys, if you recall. And I thought those were really interesting. And I thought it was also very interesting, too, that you helped support and put a lot of time and energy into the second S500 water damage document. And then I very specifically called, you were going to have your name attached to it, and you wanted to know whether they would put a dissenting viewpoint in. And essentially, Cliff and myself advocated for that, and they rejected that motion. And then you didn't want to have your name listed because you felt that without being able to put down that dissenting viewpoint, it could affect certain positions that you took in legal and litigation cases. I always remembered that, and I think a lot of people in the industry didn't get the whole point that consensus doesn't mean that everybody agrees or even the majority agrees. It means that, you go through a process, everybody's heard, And I always felt that if the Supreme Court can put that dissenting viewpoint down, why couldn't the standards organization? I don't know. They're making some changes. Maybe they'll see the light one day. No pun intended, Ed.
So just in closing, there's been a lot of stupid politics on the issue, and I've been very politically incorrect. But I'm science-based and public health-based and practical.
Hey, Ed, how come you haven't come to Steve Brick's summer camp over the years? I think you'd enjoy the heck out of that. Hey, Henry Gifford, New York, he wrote a book that came out last year called Buildings Don't Lie. And it's a hands-on practical application by applying building science to evaluate, and fix buildings. And a fabulous book. I sent an email on it last year after summer camp, and I think I probably sold about 40 books for him. About 4 or 5 people in Australia ordered it right away. I didn't want a commission. I just thought it was a good book. And if you hadn't done it, you ought to check it out. I think you probably would enjoy it. But you ought to come to summer camp.
So my answer is they haven't invited me, and I'm not going to spend $1,000. So.
Yeah. Well, no, hang on now. You could always get the invite. You could always get the invite. But not spending $1,000 is probably the bigger deal. But yeah, you could have gotten the invite.
Oh,
hey,
okay.
I'm going to wrap this up now. Ed Light, thank you so much for joining us. We always appreciate you, your unique perspective on things, Ed. Much appreciated. The Building Dynamics duo, Paul Haas and Ed Light, joined us this week. We talked about moisture, mold, and some practical answers to complex questions. We'll be back. I also want to thank my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick. John, you got to have faith at the controls. The restoration industry's global watchdog, Pete Consigli. Most importantly, our growing group of loyal listeners. We'll be back next Friday at noon with the next episode of IAQ Radio.
For IAQ Radio, I'm Spike Reel saying thanks for listening.
Thank you.